Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating cultural paradox, one that literally shapes how we live, work, and define success. We're diving into the stark contrast between the American economic hustle and the European lifestyle. But, we aren't just comparing vacation days here. We're looking at a massive disconnect between what the world's wealthiest individuals say in public and what they actually buy in private.
So let's kick things off with a pretty pointed question. Why do ultra-wealthy Americans publicly criticize European social models, calling them stagnant or lazy, yet privately spend absolute fortunes to enjoy those exact same environments? It's kind of a wild contradiction, right? On one hand, you've got this public rhetoric championing relentless output and total deregulation. But then on the other hand, the private reality is, well, it's summering in the south of France or buying up luxury apartments in highly walkable Parisian neighborhoods.
To really wrap our heads around this, we need to define what our sources call the Billionaire Paradox. It's basically this phenomenon where ultra-wealthy individuals critique those high-tax European social models mostly to maintain the U.S. economic status quo, while simultaneously using their massive private wealth to purchase European-style perks. It's an incredibly powerful narrative tool, one that deliberately separates the idea of a good life from the idea of baseline worker rights. To unpack all of this today, we're going to follow a quick four-step roadmap. First, hustle culture versus the European dream. Then, we'll look at the privatization of European perks. Third, we'll dive into the narratives around inequality and taxation. And finally, how all this maintains the status quo.
All right, jumping right into Section 1, Hustle versus the European Dream.
When we actually contrast these two regions, we're looking at two totally different definitions of a good life. The traditional American economic model is really framed around hustle culture, that relentless pursuit of maximizing output, GDP, and individual wealth accumulation. It is highly individualistic. The European reality, though, prioritizes something else entirely: quality of life, community connectivity, and a baseline social contract.
Author Jeremy Rifkin actually captures this dynamic perfectly. He argues that the European dream is just fundamentally different from the American one. As he puts it, individuals find security not through individual accumulation of wealth, but through connectivity and respect for human rights. This really reflects a post-war shift in Europe towards social market theories, essentially prioritizing a collective safety net over pure, unchecked capital accumulation.
Now, obviously, we have to note that Europe isn't just one big monolith. Our sources break down the European social model into four distinct types of welfare states. You've got the Nordic model, which is all about universal provisions, the continental model, focusing heavily on subsidies, the Anglo-Saxon model, which relies more on social assistance as a last resort, and the Mediterranean model, known for rigid employment protections. But, and here's the key takeaway, despite all those differences, they all share a baseline acceptance that the government is fundamentally responsible for the social protection of its citizens.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 2, Privatizing European Perks.
So here is where the disconnect becomes super obvious. It's all about how these benefits are framed. In Europe, things like a mandatory 4 to 6 weeks of vacation, strong parental leave, and universal health care, those are just considered standard, baseline rights for the average worker. But over in the US, those exact same lifestyle features are frequently framed as expensive, privatized rewards, things you only earn once you've successfully won the game of capitalism. And according to our sources, billionaires actively bypass standard US systems by just buying these European features entirely out of pocket. Take walkability in safe public spaces, for example. While European cities are largely walkable and safe by design, wealthy Americans will often pay absolutely astronomical real estate prices to live in exclusive, master-planned new urbanist enclaves, literally just to get that same neighborhood village feel. They skip standard healthcare for private concierge doctors who are on call 24/7, they buy premium farm-to-table food, and they use high-speed rail or private jets for travel. Essentially, they're recreating the European lifestyle. It's just funded exclusively by private wealth rather than public infrastructure.
Okay, moving on to Section 3, Inequality and Taxation Narratives. Let's look at the numbers. To really grasp the scale of wealth at the very top, we have to look at this number. According to Oxfam data, the combined wealth of EU billionaires surged by over 400 billion euros in just the first half of 2025 alone. Just think about that for a second. That is the equivalent of their wealth growing by over 2 billion euros every single day. The sheer volume of capital accumulating at the top is just staggering.
But it begs the question, who is actually funding these public systems?
Well, despite that massive surge in billionaire wealth we just talked about, it's ordinary citizens who shoulder a whopping 80% of the total tax burden through wage and consumption taxes. Corporate income taxes, they make up just 9%, and wealth taxes a mere 0.4%. So the entire system heavily relies on the everyday worker.
And this dynamic creates a highly regressive tax reality at the absolute top. Data from the EU Tax Observatory shows us that while tax rates stay relatively flat and high for the middle and upper middle classes, the effective tax rate just plummets for billionaires in countries like France, Italy, and the Netherlands. Actually, scratch that. It doesn't just plummet. These billionaires often face lower effective tax rates than the average working person. Why? Well, because ultra-wealthy individuals can structure their wealth using holding companies, retaining their earnings rather than taking taxable dividends. It completely bypasses standard income tax.
Political economist Mark Blyth highlights the ultimate insulation of the ultra-wealthy here. He notes, and I love this quote, "They have so much money, they never know when they've failed." Because when you are insulated by literally billions of dollars, you simply don't need a public safety net. You don't need public transit or universal health care. So consequently, it's entirely rational from their financial perspective to advocate for lower taxes. And they often do this by labeling the European model as socialist or stagnant, simply because a high-tax, high-service social contract doesn't benefit them financially at all.
Which leads us to our final part, Section 4, maintaining the status quo.
Ultimately, labeling the European model as lazy serves a highly strategic purpose. It's all about cultural messaging. If you can convince the average American worker that a grueling, under-benefited workweek is literally the only legitimate path to success, well, that perfectly maintains the high-output economic status quo. Crucially, it completely removes any political pressure on corporate leadership and the government to actually fund widespread European-style social benefits.
So we're going to leave you with this final thought to consider. How are these high-level narratives often pushed by individuals who secretly enjoy the very things they publicly criticize, actually influencing your own expectations of a normal work life? Are we collectively accepting burnout as some necessary badge of honor, while the architects of that very system fly private to a safe, walkable, slow-paced European city to relax? It's a paradox definitely worth keeping in mind the next time you hear a debate about work-life balance and economic success. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and we'll see you next time.